Fanning. Weekends on 2FM.
This week saw former special advisor to Boris Johnson, that's Dominic Cummings, giving evidence to a select committee on the UK's pandemic response. It was an explosive political moment captured in full on television. We can all remember times when we were glued to our TVs when seismic changes in politics took place. Well, Graham Findlay is lecturer in political theory and human rights in UCD, and he joins me now to have a look at the moments which had us rooted to the spot. Graham, how are you this fantastic Sunday afternoon? Hopefully the weather is as good in your place as it is in mine.
Yeah, I'm actually having a bit of trouble hearing you, but I hope the weather is good where you are.
Okay, well I'll shout. Graham, welcome to the programme.
That's much better, but no need to shout at this point.
I remember that thing on Nothing Ireland Like News, and now the news for the hard of hearing. Good evening! Sorry. Anyway, where am I? First of all, TV. How important is TV now in politics? I mean, do we get even the same kind of explosive moments that we once did?
Well, I think one of the benefits of being as old as I am is that you remember what it was like when there were sort of only a few major channels, and they were all mainstream forms of media, which had lots of rules, but they could also really bring publics together in ways which may not be possible now. And I mean, if we think about radio used to do this. People would gather around the radio as sort of appointment radio to listen to FDR give his fireside chats, to listen to Eamon de Valera give his Comely Maiden speech, which turned out not to be about comely maidens, but about happy maidens, I believe, to listen to Winston Churchill during the war. So radio had that power. And it was reproducible, even though the technology was nowhere we're at right now. And then TV is an incredibly powerful medium because it sucks you, and you have to pay attention to it in ways which you don't even necessarily have to pay attention to radio. And it really brought people together. And I think we all remember where we were when certain big moments happened on TV, or also, how we felt, and realizing that something was happening. And now it's not clear that we have the same experience now that it's all fragmented, both by media outlet, but also by our experience of it through the internet and through social media.
Well, hold on, Graham. You see, one of the things is now, it's obviously instant and it's everywhere, but we're not all watching the same thing. We used to all watch the same thing, and over the cooler the next day, it was exactly about what happened last night in the exact way we were presented with it. The fact that it's all over the place now, and that it can be broadsheet and tabloid in 5 seconds on whatever TV outlet, does that change the whole dynamic?
It really does. So, again, one of the interesting things about television is, people were all watching the same shows. Yeah. And I think we still have some of that in this country. I think primetime really does drive the conversation the next day. And it serves that role. I remember Questions and Answers used to do it as well. But I think we're really, really lucky in this country to have the kind of unity among the public in terms of watching these key sort of news shows, these key sort of moments. Because if you look at 24/7 cable news in the United States, it really is chopped up so that your attention span goes down even as you watch it. I mean, and so instead of having 24 hours to cover issues in depth, right, they just repeat the same thing over and over again, sort of in 3-minute bursts ad nauseum. And I think this really does turn people off in some ways. They just sort of tune a lot of it out. But also it keeps people from getting into depth and accordingly really investigating these particular things or even reflecting on them. And then when that's broadcast to you sort of back through the medium of social media, where someone said, "Did you see what your man said the other day?" You only go back and look at that one clip, maybe on Twitter, right? And you don't get the whole experience of seeing it unfold naturally.
Well, I mean, even in the kind of entertainment field, that's the case. Like a lot of these James Corden and these late night chat shows are like very late at night, and people don't see them. But what they do see is the little bits that they put together, like for instance, Carpool Karaoke or all that kind of thing. And they think they've seen everything, or they think they know everything about James Corden or all these guys. They only see the bits that are sent to them in some way. So, the paradox of recent presidential debates in the US. What about the huge number of Americans who watch them, but they do sometimes come to very different conclusions? Is that a good thing or a bad thing, or is it telling us anything?
Yeah, well, one of the sort of interesting ones was, people talk a lot about the Kennedy-Nixon debate, which, Nixon lost because he didn't appear well on television and looked pretty sweaty and uncomfortable. But everybody who listened to it on radio thought he had one, or most of the people who thought he had one. Now, one of the paradoxes of the United States is we've had more people tune into the recent presidential debates than ever before. Tens of millions of people tuned into the presidential debates, and they watched large chunks of them, at least especially the first debate. But they're going away with very, very different impressions. And that's because the rise of 24/7 cable news, which eventually started to distinguish itself by ideological slant, and Fox really has to be, cited as the Ur example of this. But that emboldened a number of other networks to take a more pronounced slant. That partisanship started to drive the actual reception of the message. And we see with the framing of particular issues, we see with the non-coverage of certain issues on Fox, but also on other media outlets, that you really get to the point where you have one objective debate which occurs, and people can, if they want, interpret it afterwards in so many different ways. And again, when we're seeing this already happen to something as dramatic as the insurrection on January 6th, where people saw on television for hours what was unfolding, but now it's being respun, even by people who were there. Congressmen who were barricading the doors are now describing it as a sort of peaceful tourist visit. So these framing effects are really, really powerful, and that suggests that the kind of fail-safes and institutions and principles which animate mainstream news and especially television organizations really are under threat by people who are serving up a lot more red meat to their viewers.
Yeah, but like what happened on January 6th, I mean, you'd think there would be a commission of inquiry into it when you think of just how absolutely huge it was in the 500 years of American whatever, and yet one whole party with the mistrust and the disinterest and the raw political sort of considerations, they moved to kill the bill and have done so, and they're not even going to take a look at it. So anyway, let's not go with that for the moment. Let's take Ireland for a second here, and we're talking, by the way, about explosive political moments on TV with Graham Finlay. And Graham, give us an Irish one that's a good example.
Well, I think actually one really great one is the P. Flynn interview on the Late Late Show. And that's really interesting in a variety of ways. So one, it's remarkable how chummy Gay, Byrne, and P. Flynn are throughout, right? And again, this was just before I moved to this country, and so this was the Ireland I moved to in some ways. And even though, as Gay sort of gives him enough rope to hang himself, nevertheless, there's this tremendous backstory, which is sort of everybody knows P. Flynn, isn't he a great guy? We're going to joke around about things, and the public are there and they're asking questions, and they ask questions which elicit a comment about just how much money he makes and how difficult it is to run three houses, and it's a sort of, and it's a really long interview. It goes on for 25, 30 minutes. And then Pat Cox calls in. It's extraordinary in some ways because of the length of it, but also just how out of touch he was able to get, and then how this could be sort of exposed on national television, which everybody is watching. And then finally, in the course of it, he manages to deeply offend an actual individual, Mr. Gilmartin, who eventually sort of exposed some of P. Flynn's dealings as a result. And so it's the intimacy of this and of certain people, but also the sort of the expansiveness and the way it was, a huge chunk of really primetime real estate.
Okay, I'll give you a blast of the first part of that.
I get, give or take, it works out at about, with expenses, 140,000 a year, and I pay 30.3% tax on that, so it's about a net 100,000. And out of that 100,000, I run a home in Dublin, Castlebar, and Brussels. I want to tell you something. Try it sometime when you have a couple of cars and three houses and three homes and a few housekeepers, and I want to tell you and everything else. But remember, it's a well-paid job.
Okay, that's that part. And as you say, he insulted the developer Tom Gilmartin, and so outraged was Tom Gilmartin that he responded by going to the McCracken Tribunal with the allegations about Flynn, and in fact, the fact that he seems so out of touch with ordinary people helped end his political career. I'll just give you a little bit of that.
Come back home for a moment. What are you going to do about the Flood Tribunal and the 50 grand, Gilmore?
Well, I want to tell you about that. I've said my piece about that. In fact, I've said too much, because you can get yourself in the High Court for undermining the tribunal. So I ain't saying no more about this, except to say just one thing, and this is all I'll say. I never asked or took money from anybody to do favours for anybody in my life.
But you know Gilmartin?
Oh, yeah.
You know Tom Gilmartin?
Yeah. I haven't seen him now for some years.
I see.
I met him. He's a Sligo man who went to England, made a lot of money, came back, wanted to do a lot of business in Ireland. Didn't work out for him. He's not well. His wife isn't well, and he's he's out of sorts.
He's out of sorts. Okay, now, I tell you, I want to move on to a different one. That's P. Flynn, and I'm going to play you a little bit of this here and you can tell me about it, because this is Charles Haughey's address to the nation in 1980.
Good evening. I wish to talk to you this evening about the state of the nation's affairs. And the picture I have to paint is not, unfortunately, a very cheerful one. The figures which are just now becoming available to us show one thing very clearly. As a community, we are living way beyond our means. I don't mean that everyone in the community is living too well. Clearly many are not, and have barely enough to get by. But taking us all together, we have been living at a rate which is simply not justified by the amount of goods and services we are producing.
Now, Graham, we're talking explosive political moments on TV. Why was that an explosive political moment on TV?
Well, partly it was relatively novel. This was Charlie Haughey adopting what you might see as a sort of American style of address to the nation, which had not been very common prior to this as Taoiseach. And so I think, and again, much of it sort of came back to haunt Haughey afterwards when his own lifestyle at the time and the forgiveness of some debts he had incurred became widely known. And so, like so many of these moments, they become important in retrospect. But again, I'll leave it to people who were there to decide whether at the time you felt like you were being lectured to by a hypocrite, and I'll put that in quotation marks perhaps, but also, whether the fact that this was at odds with some of his actual political activities, in the sense that, he certainly, as a spender, as a Taoiseach, didn't exactly hold back at various points, even after having made that speech. And so it was a really remarkable political intervention, not least because he was largely warning people not to go on strike, which is a particular kind of address to the country, which tries to dwell on people's reserves of patriotism at a time of really profound economic crisis, which affected every individual listener's lives. And I think it takes you back to the P. Flynn. The guy who asked a lot of these crucial questions of P. Flynn was talking about how, for an ordinary working-class guy in Finglas, his activities just seemed like crookery writ large and in a sophisticated way. And so, this was a chance, in a way, this sort of dissatisfaction with the actual messages being put across seems to have been a feature of Irish life during these periods.
Okay, well, just before I go to the US, just to mention also, to go back to the Late Late, Gerry Adams on the Late Late in 1994?
Yeah, again, for someone from abroad, it's quite strange that Gerry Adams had to be played by a voice actor or represented by a sort of portrait for so long. And it's really not totally clear what the thinking was behind that, except that sometimes people seem to think that Sinn Féin and Gerry Adams in particular have this magical power to sort of seduce you to the dark side, which people still seem to associate with Sinn Féin. Again, it seems it's a testimony to the power, I guess, of people appearing on television as themselves. But at the same time, it's notable that all these things happen on the Late Late, right? It's that there are certain forums or fora which everybody's watching. And again, it's still true in Ireland. I just don't think that's true in the United States. There's certain things everybody's watching, and when something new happens there, it's a big deal.
Yeah. Okay, well, then, if I go to the US, can I start with Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky?
Absolutely. That was a really interesting moment in this kind of shift in the United States, where you have Fox News, again, sort of firing up polarization, and alongside, Newt Gingrich in the House of Representatives, trying to push a very, very partisan line against Bill Clinton in terms of resisting any kind of legislative initiatives, but also culminating in his impeachment. And with his comment about how he did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky, and so on and so forth, he really set himself up for what was eventually going to be the charge which led to his impeachment, which is perjury. And so he declared that he said this in public, but he'd also said it as part of his deposition in the Paula Jones case, who had been suing Clinton for sexual harassment, and that was the charge he was impeached upon. And it did and when this was all revealed that he believed that, how to put this, oral sex is not sex, it really diminished his standing as president in a lot of people's eyes. And I know people who refused to vote for him ever again because a president should not be an adulterer, but certainly shouldn't be lying about an affair to this extent in public.
Yeah. But I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never. These allegations are false, and I need to go back to work for the American people. Thank you.
Okay, that's Bill Clinton. You mentioned Kennedy versus Nixon earlier on, and we're talking 1960 here, 3 years before he was assassinated. Tell me about that.
Well, it was a huge deal. I mean, the television was still a very young sort of medium, and it reminds me of when I was. I think I remember this. It may be one of those false memories you have. Later on, I wasn't there in 1960, but later when Nixon resigned, I was sort of woken up and brought down or made to come and watch Richard Nixon resign. But Kennedy versus Nixon was the first televised debate between two presidential candidates. And Kennedy looked good on TV, even though he wasn't particularly well his own self. He had makeup. He had prepared for TV. He was younger. And Richard Nixon wasn't looking well. He'd just gotten out of hospital, but he hadn't put on makeup, and he was sweating. He just looked bad. And despite the debate being actually fairly substantial compared to our contemporary presidential debates, it was those visual images which really decided who won and who lost. Again, if you just listened to the debate on radio, you'd see Jack Kennedy determinedly trying to assert his own anti-communist credentials, because Nixon's reputation had been as a communist fighter, and he had, as a Democrat, to suggest that he was neither a slave to the Catholic Church and that he was going to be just as tough on communism as Nixon. But in the end, people went with the visual images that they saw rather than what they were listening to.
And it is a fact that through most of these last 25 years, the Republican leadership has opposed federal aid for education, medical care for the aged, development of the Tennessee Valley, development of our natural resources. I think Mr. Nixon is an effective leader of his party. I hope he would grant me the same. The question before us is, which point of view and which party do we want to lead the United States?
It does all seem so scripted, but it all seems so civilised compared to the nonsense that, Biden had to go right down to the very bottom in order to be kind of up against, if you like, Donald Trump during the presidential debates there some time recently. And it just looked to people around the world saying, so that's democracy? I don't think we want any of that.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, ever since sort of some of the classic sound bites, which are the only thing we remember from presidential debates, Ronald Reagan talking about how he wasn't going to exploit his opponent's youth and inexperience, right? When Reagan's age had been a concern, or Lloyd Bentsen telling Dan Quayle he's no Jack Kennedy, and so on and so forth. People have since then been looking for the killer joke or the killer soundbite, and we just don't remember the actual substantial points, largely because they often aren't there. It's that people are looking for that killer soundbite, which will then go out on Twitter, and then people can go back and enjoy that particular soundbite. I mean, I think the closest we have from Biden is something like, will you shut up, man? So it really is a sign of the sort of degradation of the presidential debate through the medium of television, and then through the medium of television recaptured in our imaginations by social media.
Well, one that I have a great memory of is the next one that I want to look at here, because, what do you call it? Kennedy beat Nixon in the 60s and became the president. But later, Nixon became president, and if I'm right about this, I think in 72 or thereabouts, he won the biggest landslide in the history of American politics to become president, and he was the president of America, and then, of course, he had to resign, the only president in office who ever had to resign. And I was working in a fairground in the only state in America that didn't vote for Nixon. I'll tell you, burning effigies on the beach that night was only half the battle. It was just madness. I'm going to give you a little bit here now, Frost and Nixon.
Well, I must say, I sort of cracked up. Started to cry, pushed my chair back, and then I blurted it out. And I said, I'm sorry. I just hope I haven't let you down. Well, when I said, I just hope I haven't let you down, that said it all. I had.
So what do you think, Graham?
I mean, again, they even made a movie of it, and there's not too many interviews with politicians which get turned into sort of mainstream Hollywood movies. But, that was really interesting, again, from the how point of view, in the sense that Frost was sort of on the outs with television. He didn't really have a job, and so the reason he got Nixon was Nixon had a book to promote, and he paid Nixon for the interviews, and then he and a bunch of investors paid the television stations to broadcast them. None of the mainstream television journalists would pay Nixon to be interviewed, and because their own sort of internal principles of objectivity and not engaging in checkbook journalism prevented it. Yeah. But eventually it was a pretty good investment for Frost, because it really was a sort of seminal set of interviews, which, people said undermined even further the sort of confidence and respect for both the president and the office of the president, which Nixon had achieved over the course of his career.
Okay, well now I want to go to the UK for just one or two. Jeremy Paxman versus Michael Howard, very famous, from 1997. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's more important that he just keeps asking the questions. And Jeremy Paxman is a really, really interesting figure in that he's not the first, but he's one of the original sort of dogged interviewers who's almost treating every interview as a contest. And this is a relatively recent development where the interviewer is a celebrity in their own right. I mean, I know we have a few of them in Ireland as well, but, the interviewer's reputation precedes them, and every interview is like a war. And so that's what I think is interesting about Jeremy Paxman versus Michael Howard, because I don't think Howard ever answered him.
I was entitled to express my views. I was entitled to be consulted.
Did you threaten to overrule
I was not entitled to instruct Derek Lewis, and I did not instruct him. And
did you threaten to overrule him?
The truth of the matter is that Mr. Marriott was not suspended.
Did you threaten to overrule him?
I did not overrule Derek Lewis.
Did you threaten to overrule him?
I took advice on what I could or could not do.
Did you threaten to overrule him, Mr. Howard?
I acted scrupulously in accordance with that advice. I did not overrule Derek Lewis.
Did you threaten to overrule
Mr. Marriott?
And on and on and on. What about, I just want to give one different one here, the Challenger disaster in 1986. Tell me about that.
I think there's a whole new type of viewing which brings us all together, which is when some particular disaster happens. And for me, it was the Challenger disaster in 86, which I remember just running on a loop, the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger over and over and over again all day in a way which was quite strange when I look back on it. And the same thing was true of 9/11. 9/11 had various moments, like when the towers came down, but it was just rolling on the television all day and on into the future. And that is a different experience of television, where you just sort of watch in horror as something truly awful unfolds in front of you. Same thing was true of Hurricane Katrina for Americans when they watched their government spectacularly fail to take care of people. And the LA riots, where the violence went on for days and days. And so I think that's a different kind of experience, where you might not even be able to point to one thing, but it brings people together as they sort of are appalled at what can happen in their country.
Right, indeed. And just finally, you did mention it earlier, storming the Capitol was just a thing, wasn't it, on January the 6th, that stays with you forever?
It has. I'm glad someone told me about it, because I don't actually normally watch a lot of TV, but it was really one of those moments which I thought myself and my 3 American citizens in the House really need, especially my children, really needed to see, just so they can think. But again, how long did that memory, the sort of searing memory of that kind of violence, stay in people's minds in a sort of something we could objectively agree on before things started to get spun? And that makes me very, very worried about the future of American democracy. Okay,
Graham, it's been a pleasure as usual. Thank you very much indeed for being with us in the programme again. That is Graham Finlay, lecturer in political theory and human rights in University College Dublin. We're talking explosive political moments on TV, so I'll just give you a little bit of one of those now that you mentioned, and that's the Challenger disaster on CNN. Thanks, Graham. Good luck. Take it easy.
Thanks, Dave.
The shuttle mission is now on the way after more delays than NASA cares to count. This morning, it looked as though they were not going to be able to get off.
1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Looks like a couple of the solid rocket boosters blew away from the side of the shuttle in an explosion.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
Dave Fanning, weekends on 2FM.